fisherman's simple question in a dusty marketplace would eventually topple emperors, reshape civilizations, and change the course of human history forever. But what happened next? How did a movement that began with 12 ordinary men sharing meals and stories transform into something completely unrecognizable within just 3 centuries? The year is 33 AD. In the narrow streets of Jerusalem, a small group of followers gather in secret. They're not building cathedrals or wearing golden robes. They're not debating complex theology or establishing hierarchies. They're simply trying to remember what their teacher told them, sharing everything they own and eating together as equals. Their message is revolutionary in its simplicity. Love your neighbor, care for the poor, and treat everyone as family. But by 380 AD, less than 350 years later, Christianity has become the official religion of the Roman Empire. Massive basilicas tower over cities. Bishops wear purple robes reserved for royalty. Complex doctrines require years of study to understand. The poor are told their reward awaits in heaven, while church leaders accumulate vast wealth. Imperial armies march under Christian banners to conquer distant lands. What happened in those crucial 3 centuries? How did a movement that began with "the last shall be first" become one where the first ruled absolutely? This isn't a story about faith versus doubt or right versus wrong. This is the story of how power, politics, and human nature transformed the most influential movement in human history. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual metamorphosis, like watching a butterfly slowly fold its wings back into a cocoon. But unlike that natural process, this change was driven by very human forces: ambition, fear, political necessity, and the intoxicating allure of worldly power. Let me take you back to where it all began, in the scorching heat of a Palestinian summer, where everything was about to change forever. In 30 AD, the Roman Empire stretched from Britain to the Euphrates River. It was a world of strict social hierarchies where your birth determined your destiny. Slaves served masters who served nobles who served Caesar, who claimed to be a god. The poor died young and nameless, while the wealthy built monuments to their own glory. Into this world stepped an itinerant preacher from Nazareth, a nowhere town that even other Palestinians mocked. Jesus of Nazareth brought a message that was nothing short of revolutionary. God cared more about a widow's last coin than an emperor's golden palace. The kingdom of heaven belonged to children, prostitutes, and tax collectors rather than priests and politicians. Those who wanted to lead must become servants. Those who wanted to be first must become last. But here's what's fascinating about those earliest followers. They took these teachings literally. The book of Acts describes the first Christian community in Jerusalem. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. This wasn't metaphorical. These people actually shared everything. Barnabas, a wealthy landowner, sold his fields and gave the money to the apostles to distribute. Others did the same. They met in each other's homes, broke bread together, and made decisions as a community. There were no church buildings, no professional clergy, no organizational hierarchy beyond the 12 apostles who had known Jesus personally. Women played prominent roles. Mary Magdalene was called the apostle to the apostles. Priscilla taught theology. Phoebe was a deacon who carried Paul's letter to the Romans. In a world where women were considered property, early Christianity was radically egalitarian. This wasn't just happening in Jerusalem. As the message spread throughout the Roman Empire, these house churches maintained the same character. In Corinth, a wealthy woman named Lydia opened her home to believers. In Rome, Christians met in the catacombs, underground burial chambers where rich and poor, slave and free were buried side by side as equals. The Roman authorities initially saw Christians as just another Jewish sect, but they soon realized this movement was different. Christians refused to worship the emperor or serve in the military. They practiced a radical form of charity that made Roman society's inequalities seem cruel by comparison. Most dangerously, they proclaimed allegiance to a different king, Jesus Christ. The persecutions began sporadically under Nero in 64 AD, who blamed Christians for the Great Fire of Rome. But even under torture and death, something remarkable happened. The movement grew faster. The blood of martyrs, as one early writer put it, became the seed of the church. Polycarp, an elderly bishop in Smyrna, was burned alive in 155 AD rather than deny his faith. As the flames surrounded him, witnesses reported he prayed not for deliverance but for his persecutors. Stories like these spread throughout the empire, attracting more converts who were amazed by this different kind of courage. By the end of the first century, something subtle but significant was already beginning to change. The original apostles were dying off. The immediate expectation of Jesus' return was fading. New questions arose. Who had authority to interpret Jesus' teachings? How should churches be organized? What did Christians believe about complex theological questions? The Didache, one of the earliest Christian documents outside the New Testament, reveals these growing pains. Written around 100 AD, it provides instructions for everything from baptism to handling traveling missionaries. The fact that such a manual was needed shows that the simple, spontaneous character of earliest Christianity was becoming more structured. Paul's letters written decades earlier already hint at this evolution. In 1 Corinthians, he addresses conflicts about leadership, spiritual gifts, and social behavior. In his later letters to Timothy and Titus, he provides detailed instructions for appointing bishops and deacons. The organic, spirit-led community was gradually becoming an institution. By the 2nd century, a clear hierarchy was emerging. Ignatius of Antioch, writing around 110 AD, insisted that bishops had unique authority that came directly from God. "Follow your bishop," he wrote, "as Jesus Christ followed the Father." This was a dramatic shift from the earliest communities where decisions were made collectively, and leadership was viewed as service rather than authority. The reasons for this change were both practical and theological. As Christianity spread across vast distances, maintaining unity became challenging. Different communities developed different practices and beliefs. Some groups, later called Gnostics, claimed secret knowledge. Others, like the Marcionites, rejected parts of what became the Bible. Church leaders argued that strong episcopal authority was necessary to preserve authentic Christianity. But something precious was being lost in the process. The radical equality of the early church was giving way to a system that began to mirror the very Roman hierarchies Christianity had originally challenged. Hello everyone, this is Professor Archive, and I'm curious, where in the world are you watching this from? And what time is it where you are? Are you a student, a teacher, or perhaps someone in a completely different profession who just loves diving deep into history? Drop a comment and let me know. I love connecting with fellow history enthusiasts from around the globe. By 200 AD, Christianity had spread throughout the Roman Empire, but it was becoming something the original apostles might not have recognized. Let me tell you about a man named Callistus, who became Bishop of Rome around 200 AD. His story perfectly illustrates how far things had already traveled from those simple house churches. Callistus had been a slave who embezzled money from his Christian master. He was imprisoned, attempted suicide, and later was freed and became involved in Roman banking. Eventually, he worked his way up through the church hierarchy to become its leader in Rome. But here's the shocking part. As bishop, Callistus lived in luxury that rivaled Roman senators. He wore fine clothes, lived in a palace, and commanded an organization that owned vast properties throughout the city. Compare this to Peter, the fisherman whom Catholics consider their first pope. Peter owned so little that when he encountered a lame beggar asking for money, he said, "Silver and gold I do not have, but what I do have I give you. In the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, walk." Less than 2 centuries later, the Bishop of Rome controlled more wealth than most provincial governors. This transformation accelerated dramatically in the 3rd century. The church was developing not just wealth, but increasingly complex theology. Where early Christians had focused on simple teachings about love and forgiveness, theologians now debated intricate questions about the nature of Christ, the Trinity, and salvation that required years of education to understand. Origen of Alexandria, one of the most influential theologians of this period, wrote over 6,000 works exploring Christian doctrine. His theological system was so complex that it took teams of scholars to copy and study his writings. This was a far cry from Jesus telling his disciples, "Let the little children come to me, for such is the kingdom of heaven." The visual symbols of Christianity were changing too. Early Christian art shows Jesus as a young shepherd or teacher. By the 3rd century, artistic depictions increasingly showed Christ as a powerful ruler, wearing imperial robes and sitting on thrones. The imagery was shifting from servant to sovereign. But the most dramatic transformation was yet to come. Everything changed on October 28, 312 AD, at a bridge outside Rome where two armies prepared for battle. Constantine, a Roman general fighting for control of the empire, later claimed he saw a vision of a cross in the sky with the words, "In this sign, conquer." Whether this vision was real, a political calculation, or a combination of both, Constantine ordered his soldiers to paint Christian symbols on their shields. They won the battle decisively. Within a year, Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, making Christianity legal throughout the empire. For the first time in almost 3 centuries, Christians could worship openly without fear of persecution. Churches celebrated across the Roman world. Finally, they were free. But freedom came with a price that few anticipated. Constantine didn't just legalize Christianity, he began actively promoting it. He funded the construction of magnificent churches, including the original St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. He granted bishops civil authority and exempted church property from taxes. He made Sunday an official day of rest throughout the empire. More significantly, Constantine involved himself directly in church affairs. When theological disputes arose, he convened councils and enforced their decisions with imperial authority. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, which established fundamental Christian doctrines about the nature of Christ, was called not by church leaders but by the emperor himself. Picture this scene. Bishops from across the empire, many bearing scars from recent persecutions, gathering in the emperor's palace in Nicaea. They wore silk robes provided by Constantine and dined at his table. The same imperial authority that had once thrown Christians to lions was now defining what Christians should believe. The irony was profound. Christianity had survived 3 centuries of persecution while maintaining its essential character. But it might not survive imperial favor. Constantine himself wasn't even baptized until he was on his deathbed. Throughout his reign as Christianity's great patron, he continued to hold the pagan title Pontifex Maximus, chief priest of the Roman state religion. He delayed baptism because, according to contemporary practice, it would wash away all his sins. And he apparently wanted to continue sinning until the last possible moment. This set a troubling precedent. The emperor could promote Christianity while living in ways that directly contradicted its teachings. Constantine murdered his wife and eldest son, yet remained the church's great protector. Church leaders, dependent on imperial favor, found ways to rationalize or ignore such contradictions. By 380 AD, Emperor Theodosius made Christianity not just legal but mandatory. Pagan temples were closed or destroyed. Other religious practices were banned. The religion that had once been persecuted was now doing the persecuting. Bishop Ambrose of Milan exemplified this new relationship between church and state. When Emperor Theodosius ordered a massacre in Thessalonica that killed thousands of civilians, Ambrose excommunicated him until he did public penance. This might seem like the church standing up to power, but look closer. Ambrose wasn't challenging the emperor's right to use violence. He was insisting that such violence required church approval and subsequent absolution. The church was becoming an integral part of the imperial system rather than its prophetic voice. Let me tell you about Augustine of Hippo, whose theology would dominate Christianity for the next 1,000 years. Augustine had been a pagan philosopher and teacher before converting to Christianity in 386 AD. His background in Roman political thought shaped how he understood the church's role in the world. Augustine developed what he called the two cities doctrine. There was the city of God, which represented spiritual reality, and the city of man, which represented earthly political structures. Unlike early Christians who had seen these as incompatible, Augustine argued they could work together. The earthly city could serve the heavenly city through the use of force to maintain order and suppress heresy. This theological innovation provided religious justification for what was already happening practically. The church was becoming an institution of worldly power. Augustine's just war theory legitimized Christian participation in violence, overturning centuries of Christian pacifism. His teachings on original sin emphasized human depravity in ways that required institutional church authority to mediate salvation. Where early Christians had believed they could live as Jesus taught through the power of the Holy Spirit, Augustine taught that humans were too corrupted by sin to achieve righteousness without elaborate sacramental systems administered by ordained clergy. The priesthood of all believers was giving way to the priesthood of professional priests. Meanwhile, the practical changes were just as dramatic. By 400 AD, many bishops lived like Roman nobles. They wore purple robes, lived in palaces, and commanded armies of clergy. The Bishop of Rome was beginning to claim authority not just over local churches, but over all Christianity everywhere. Pope Damasus IV, who served from 366 to 384 AD, was called the ear tickler of matrons for his popularity among wealthy Roman women, who funded his lavish lifestyle. When he died, his tomb was decorated with costly marbles and precious stones. The contrast with the simple fisherman who founded the church could not have been starker. The transformation was also theological. Early Christians had expected an imminent second coming of Christ that would establish God's kingdom on earth. By the 4th century, the church was teaching that God's kingdom was primarily spiritual and would be fully realized only after death. This shift conveniently reduced pressure for radical social change in the present. Where early Christians had practiced radical economic sharing, the church now taught that poverty was spiritually beneficial for the poor, while wealth was a responsibility for the rich. Instead of sell everything and give to the poor, the message became give generously to the church, which will distribute to the worthy poor. Marriage provides another telling example. Paul had written that celibacy was preferable to marriage, but he treated this as a personal choice for those with that particular calling. By the 4th century, church leaders were developing an elaborate theology that treated celibacy as spiritually superior to marriage and sexual desire as inherently sinful even within marriage. This wasn't just abstract theology. It was creating a priestly class that was fundamentally separate from ordinary believers. Celibate clergy, supported by the church rather than their own labor, formed an elite that mediated between God and ordinary Christians. The architecture of Christian worship was changing too. Early Christians had met in homes and simple buildings, sitting in circles where everyone could see and hear each other. The new churches built under Constantine followed the design of Roman basilicas. Long, narrow buildings where a small group of clergy performed rituals at the front, while hundreds of lay people observed passively from a distance. The Eucharist, which had begun as a simple shared meal where Jesus' followers remembered his teachings, was becoming an elaborate ritual that only ordained priests could perform. Ordinary believers went from participants to spectators. But perhaps the most fundamental change was in how Christians understood their relationship to the world around them. Early Christians had seen themselves as aliens and strangers in a fallen world, called to live by different values regardless of social consequences. 4th century Christians increasingly saw themselves as responsible for Christianizing the entire society through law, force, and political control. This shift is perfectly illustrated by the contrast between two Christian responses to military service. In 295 AD, a young Roman soldier named Maximilian was executed for refusing military service because, as he told the court, "I cannot serve in the military, I cannot do evil, I am a Christian." Less than a century later, Christian emperors were requiring all soldiers to be baptized, and Augustine was developing theories about when Christians should wage war. St. John Chrysostom, the golden-tongued preacher of Constantinople, exemplified the contradictions of this new Christianity. His sermons contained beautiful passages about caring for the poor and living simply. But he also supported the use of imperial force against heretics and lived in luxury that scandalized even his contemporaries. When criticized for his lavish lifestyle, he argued that bishops needed to maintain dignity appropriate to their office. By 400 AD, the institutional church owned vast estates throughout the empire. The Bishop of Alexandria controlled the grain supply that fed Constantinople. The Roman Church owned properties from Sicily to Dalmatia. Monasteries accumulated so much wealth that they became major economic powers. Yet the most tragic aspect wasn't the wealth itself, but how it changed the church's relationship to the poor. Early Christians had shared their possessions because they saw fellow believers as family. 4th century Christianity developed complex theories about different types of poverty and deserving versus undeserving poor. Charity became professionalized and bureaucratized. Jerome, the scholar who translated the Bible into Latin, perfectly captured this transformation in his correspondence with wealthy Christian women. Where early Christian leaders had challenged the rich to give up their wealth, Jerome wrote letters explaining how wealthy Christians could live luxuriously while still being spiritual, provided they also gave generously to the church and practiced certain religious disciplines. The theological justifications were becoming as elaborate as the lifestyles they protected. Clement of Alexandria had written that wealth itself wasn't sinful, only attachment to wealth. This subtle distinction opened the door for unlimited accumulation as long as one's heart remained properly detached. John Cassian developed theories about how God had ordained different levels of society, and that attempting to change these levels was actually rebellion against God's plan. The radical egalitarianism of early Christianity was being replaced by theological justifications for hierarchy and inequality. If you're finding this deep dive into early church history as fascinating as I am, consider leaving a super thanks to help support the channel. Your support helps me spend the time needed to research these complex historical transformations and share them with fellow history lovers like yourself. The most telling symbol of this transformation might be the story of Anthony the Great, often considered the father of Christian monasticism. Anthony had heard Jesus' words, "If you want to be perfect, sell everything you have and give to the poor," and took them literally. Around 270 AD, he gave away his inheritance and went into the Egyptian desert to live in poverty and prayer. But within decades of Anthony's death, the monastic movement he inspired was accumulating vast wealth. Monasteries became major landowners. Abbots lived like princes. The institution created to preserve the radical simplicity of early Christianity became another avenue for wealth and power. By 450 AD, the abbot of a major monastery commanded more resources than many provincial governors. The monks who had originally owned nothing personally now controlled estates worked by thousands of tenant farmers. The very institution designed to embody Jesus' teachings about poverty and simplicity had become a major economic power. This pattern repeated across every aspect of church life. What began as movements to preserve authentic Christianity became new sources of institutional power and wealth. The liturgy itself reflected this transformation. Early Christian worship had been spontaneous and participatory. The didache mentions simple prayers and communal meals. By the 5th century, Christian worship was becoming an elaborate theatrical performance, with complex rituals, expensive vestments, and professional musicians. The language was changing too. Early Christians had preached in the common language of ordinary people. By the 4th century, church services were increasingly conducted in formal, archaic language that ordinary believers couldn't fully understand. Latin was becoming the sacred language of Western Christianity, even in regions where people spoke other languages. This wasn't just about style, it was about power. When religious language becomes incomprehensible to ordinary people, it creates dependency on professional interpreters. The priesthood was becoming not just a spiritual office, but an intellectual elite with exclusive access to sacred knowledge. The biblical manuscripts themselves tell this story. Early Christian writings were copied on simple papyrus and written in the common Greek that merchants and fishermen could read. By the 4th century, the Bible was being copied onto expensive parchment, written in elaborate scripts and bound in covers decorated with gold and jewels. These weren't just beautiful artifacts, they were symbols of how Christianity was moving from the common people to the wealthy and powerful. A jewel-encrusted Bible that cost more than a farmer earned in a lifetime sent a very different message than the simple papyrus scrolls that circulated among early house churches. The transformation was also geographical. Early Christianity had been strongest among the urban poor and lower middle classes throughout the empire. By the 5th century, it was becoming the religion of choice for the aristocracy, while rural populations often clung to older pagan traditions. The very demographics of Christianity were shifting upward in social class. This social transformation had theological consequences. When Christianity was primarily a religion of slaves, freedmen, and urban workers, its emphasis on radical equality and economic sharing made perfect sense. When it became the religion of emperors and senators, these teachings required elaborate reinterpretation. The spiritual gospel of John, which emphasized internal spiritual reality over external circumstances, became increasingly prominent. The social gospel teachings of Luke and James, which emphasized practical care for the poor and criticism of the wealthy, received less attention or were interpreted in purely spiritual terms. Augustine's theology of predestination reflected this shift. Where early Christians had believed that anyone could choose to follow Jesus and live as he taught, Augustine developed complex theories about how God predetermined who would be saved and who would be damned. This doctrine conveniently explained why some people remained poor and powerless while others accumulated wealth and authority. It was all part of God's mysterious plan. The most devastating change was in how Christians understood the relationship between faith and works. James had written, "Faith without works is dead," and early Christians had understood this to mean that genuine faith naturally expressed itself in radical love and service. Augustine's emphasis on salvation by faith alone, while theologically sophisticated, had the practical effect of separating spiritual status from social behavior. A wealthy Christian could now maintain his riches while the poor suffered, confident that his salvation depended on correct belief rather than sacrificial action. This theological innovation made Christianity compatible with vast inequality in ways that would have horrified the apostles. The Church's relationship to slavery perfectly illustrates this transformation. Early Christian communities had included both slaves and masters, but the radical equality of Christian fellowship had created tremendous tension with the institution of slavery itself. Paul's letter to Philemon suggests that Christian brotherhood should transcend legal categories of ownership. By the 4th century, the Church not only accepted slavery but became one of the largest slave owners in the empire. Monasteries used slave labor to work their vast estates. Church fathers developed elaborate theological justifications for slavery as part of God's plan for maintaining social order. Augustine argued that slavery was a result of sin, but also a divine punishment that should be accepted rather than resisted. John Chrysostom preached that slaves should serve their masters faithfully as a form of Christian obedience. The religion that had once proclaimed there is neither slave nor free was now blessing the chains. The treatment of women provides another stark example of this transformation. The New Testament mentions women as deacons, prophets, and church leaders. Priscilla taught theology to men. Phoebe carried Paul's letters and apparently had authority to interpret them. Mary Magdalene was called the apostle to the apostles. By the 4th century, women were being systematically excluded from church leadership. The theological justifications were elaborate. Women were naturally more susceptible to deception. Their monthly cycles made them ritually impure. Their role was to be silent and submissive. None of these arguments appeared in early Christian writings, but they became standard church doctrine. The irony is profound. The same church fathers who praised female martyrs for their courage in defying Roman authority simultaneously taught that women should be excluded from church authority because of their weakness and inferiority. This wasn't just about gender roles, it was about the fundamental character of Christianity. Early Christianity had been revolutionary in its inclusion of those who were marginalized by Roman society: women, slaves, the poor, ethnic minorities. 4th century Christianity was developing theological reasons why these same groups should remain marginalized within the church itself. The missionary methods were changing too. Early Christians had spread their faith through personal relationships, acts of service, and the attractiveness of their communities. The message had spread despite persecution because people were drawn to the radical love they witnessed among believers. By the 5th century, Christianity was spreading through imperial mandate, military conquest, and destruction of competing religions. Theodosius ordered the closure of pagan temples and banned non-Christian religious practices. Christian mobs, often led by monks, destroyed ancient libraries and artistic treasures that represented thousands of years of human culture. The Serapeum in Alexandria, one of the greatest libraries in the ancient world, was destroyed by Christian crowds in 391 AD. The philosopher Hypatia was murdered by a Christian mob in 415 AD. The Academy in Athens, which had operated for nearly 1,000 years, was closed by Christian emperors in 529 AD. Christianity was no longer winning converts through the attractiveness of its communities. It was eliminating alternatives through the use of force. The religion that had once been persecuted was now the persecutor. This violent intolerance wasn't an aberration. It was the logical result of the transformation we've been tracing. When Christianity becomes identified with worldly power rather than prophetic witness, it inevitably uses worldly methods to advance its goals. Augustine developed the theological justification for this approach in his doctrine of compel them to come in, based on a parable of Jesus. But Augustine interpreted this parable to mean that the church should use force to bring people into the faith, directly contradicting Jesus' own methods and teachings. The most telling aspect of this transformation is how it affected the reading of Scripture itself. Early Christians had read the Bible looking for guidance on how to live as Jesus taught. By the 5th century, church leaders were reading the Bible looking for justifications for how they were already living. When Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor," early Christians shared their possessions. When 4th century bishops read the same words, they developed complex interpretations about spiritual poverty that allowed them to accumulate vast wealth while claiming to follow Christ's teachings. When Jesus said, "Turn the other cheek," early Christians practiced pacifism even unto death. When 4th century Christians read the same words, they developed theories about how cheek-turning applied only to personal relationships, not to church or state policy. When Jesus said, "The last shall be first," early Christians created communities where leaders served others. When 4th century church leaders read the same words, they argued that accepting worldly authority was actually a form of humble service to God's plan. The hermeneutical gymnastics required to reconcile imperial Christianity with the teachings of Jesus became increasingly elaborate. Church fathers developed complex allegorical methods of interpretation that could make Scripture support almost any position. But perhaps the most tragic loss was the disappearance of eschatological hope. Early Christians had lived with the expectation that God's kingdom was breaking into the world through their communities. Their radical practices weren't just moral obligations, they were signs of the coming transformation of all creation. By the 4th century, the church was teaching that God's kingdom was primarily spiritual and otherworldly. The second coming was postponed to the distant future. Christians were no longer called to embody God's kingdom on earth, but to endure this fallen world while hoping for a better existence after death. This theological shift had enormous practical consequences. If God's kingdom is purely future and spiritual, then present social arrangements don't need to be challenged. If Christianity is primarily about individual salvation rather than social transformation, then the church doesn't need to address systemic injustice. The early Christian practice of economic sharing was replaced by individual charity. The early Christian rejection of violence was replaced by just war theory. The early Christian embrace of simplicity was replaced by stewardship theology that blessed accumulation. By 500 AD, the transformation was complete. Christianity had become the religion of the Roman Empire in every sense. Its bishops lived like senators, its abbots controlled vast estates, its theologians blessed the existing social order, and its armies conquered territories in the name of Christ. The fishermen who had left their nets to follow a wandering preacher would have found this imperial Christianity utterly foreign. The communities that had shared everything in common would have seen these vast church properties as a betrayal of Jesus' teachings. The martyrs who had died rather than worship Caesar would have been horrified to see Christian emperors claiming divine authority. And yet, throughout this entire transformation, church leaders continued to claim they were faithfully following Christ. They quoted the same scriptures, performed the same sacraments, and used the same creeds. The external forms of Christianity remained, while its essential spirit had been transformed into its opposite. This is perhaps the most sobering lesson from this history. Institutions can maintain religious language and rituals while completely abandoning the values they originally represented. The name Christian could be preserved even as Christianity itself was lost. The early church had understood that following Jesus meant choosing between God and Caesar, between the kingdom of heaven and the kingdoms of this world. By the 4th century, the church was teaching that these choices were false dilemmas. One could serve both God and Caesar, both heaven and earth, both Christ and empire. But as we've seen throughout this story, that compromise came at a price. The radical edge of Christianity was dulled. Its prophetic voice was silenced. Its transformative power was domesticated. The salt lost its saltiness, and the light was hidden under the bushel of imperial respectability. The question this history raises is not whether 4th century Christianity was legitimate or illegitimate. That's a theological judgment beyond the scope of historical analysis. The question is whether we can honestly say it was the same movement that began in those house churches in Jerusalem. The Christianity that conquered the Roman Empire was powerful, sophisticated, and influential. But was it the Christianity that the Roman Empire had originally persecuted? The evidence suggests that somewhere in those crucial 3 centuries, one thing died and something else was born, even though both carried the same name. This transformation wasn't inevitable. At multiple points along the way, different choices could have been made. Individual leaders could have refused imperial favor. Church councils could have maintained earlier practices. Theologians could have developed different interpretations. The trajectory wasn't determined by historical forces beyond human control. It was the result of thousands of individual decisions by people who face the same temptations that every generation faces. The story of how Christianity lost its way in just 300 years is ultimately a human story about the corrupting influence of power, the tendency of institutions to serve their own interests, and the difficulty of maintaining prophetic witness in the face of worldly success. But it's also a story that offers hope. If these changes weren't inevitable, then they aren't permanent. If Christianity could be transformed once, it can be transformed again. The question is whether each generation will choose the narrow road that leads to life or the broad road that leads to destruction. The fisherman's simple question in that dusty marketplace, "What must we do?" still echoes across the centuries. The answer hasn't changed, even if our ability to hear it has been compromised by centuries of theological sophistication and institutional self-interest. Perhaps the most important lesson from this history is that every generation must decide anew what it means to follow Jesus. We cannot simply inherit our faith from previous generations. We must discover it for ourselves, just as those first disciples did in the streets of Jerusalem. The Christianity that emerges from that discovery might look very different from the Christianity we've inherited. It might be simpler, more radical, more costly, and more threatening to existing power structures. But it might also be more faithful to the one who said, "Follow me," and meant it literally. As we close this deep dive into one of history's most consequential transformations, I want to thank all of you who've stayed with us through this complex story. If this kind of historical analysis resonates with you, please consider subscribing to Professor Archive and hitting that notification bell. History has so much to teach us about our present moment, and I'm grateful to be exploring these questions with fellow seekers of truth. Remember, the story of Christianity's transformation isn't just ancient history. It's a mirror that reflects the choices every institution and every individual faces when confronted with the choice between prophetic witness and worldly success. The question that history poses to us is simple. Which will we choose? The fisherman's question still awaits our answer.